The moment I heard strangers talking inside my locked garage, I realized somebody had made a mistake they could never erase. My name is Daniel Carter, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought the worst thing an overreaching homeowners association could do was send another stack of violation letters to my mailbox. I had no idea I was about to catch them doing something they would spend weeks trying to explain away. I had left home just after 7 o'clock that morning to inspect a historic farmhouse restoration about 30 miles away. Around 11, I realized I had forgotten my laser measuring tool, a piece of equipment I used almost every day. Buying another one would have cost hundreds of dollars, so I called my client, apologized for the delay, and headed back home. The neighborhood looked unusually quiet when I turned onto my street. Lawns had already been mowed, sprinklers clicked rhythmically across bright green grass, and the only sound was a distant leaf blower somewhere around the corner. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I pulled into my driveway. The detached garage sat exactly where it always had, its gray overhead door completely closed. My pickup truck rolled to a stop, and I reached for my keys before freezing. I could hear voices. At first I thought perhaps a radio had somehow been left on, but then I recognized actual conversation. Someone laughed softly. Another voice mentioned storage shelves. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew every door on my property had been locked when I left that morning because checking them had become a habit after months of escalating disputes with our homeowners association. I quietly stepped out of the truck without closing the door completely, careful not to make unnecessary noise. As I moved across the driveway, I noticed something even stranger. The small side service door to the garage was pulled almost shut but had not latched completely. A narrow gap, barely an inch wide, revealed movement inside. I slowed my breathing and approached carefully. Through the opening, I could see two people wearing navy jackets with embroidered Homeowners Association compliance logos on the chest. One held a clipboard while the other raised a camera toward my tool cabinets. Another person stood near my workbench opening plastic storage bins as though everything inside belonged to them. My first instinct was to demand an explanation, but years of working construction had taught me something important. The first person to lose control usually loses the advantage. Instead, I quietly reached into my pocket and opened the security application on my phone. Every camera appeared online. The driveway camera, the garage ceiling camera, the rear workbench camera. Even the small camera mounted above the interior side entrance showed a perfectly clear view of everyone inside. They had not noticed a single one. I tapped the recording archive and watched the live timeline continue without interruption. Every movement they made was being saved automatically with synchronized timestamps. One inspector opened a cabinet containing specialty woodworking tools, while another pointed toward shelves holding paint cans and restoration supplies. I listened as one voice confidently said they finally had enough evidence to prove I was violating neighborhood rules. Hearing that sentence almost made me smile because I knew something they did not. Whatever story they planned to tell later had already begun falling apart the moment they stepped into my locked garage, without realizing I was quietly watching every second unfold from only a few feet away. I stayed exactly where I was, watching the live camera feed on my phone, while every second added another piece to a story that had actually begun months earlier. None of this had started because of anything unusual I had done. I restored historic homes for a living, and my detached garage served as my workshop, where I repaired antique doors, refinished original trim, and stored specialized tools that could not be left at job sites overnight. Delivery trucks stopped by a few times each week with lumber, hardware, or reclaimed materials. My pickup often left before sunrise and returned after dinner, depending on the project schedule. To anyone willing to ask a simple question, everything about my property made perfect sense. Unfortunately, Susan Whitmore never believed in asking questions before reaching conclusions. As the Homeowners Association compliance director, she seemed convinced that every unfamiliar vehicle was evidence of a hidden business operation violating neighborhood rules. The first letter arrived 6 months earlier, claiming I was operating commercial equipment from my residence. I responded politely with photographs showing that every restoration project was completed off-site and that my garage was used only for storing personal tools and preparing materials. A week later, another notice appeared, this time accusing me of excessive contractor traffic. I answered again, including copies of my city business license, which clearly listed a commercial office across town rather than my home address. Instead of ending the matter, the accusations became more creative. One notice claimed neighbors had reported hazardous storage. Another suggested I was converting the garage into a warehouse. Every letter included broad statements, but almost no specific facts. I requested the exact rule I had supposedly violated and asked for any inspection reports supporting those claims. The responses never addressed my questions directly. They simply repeated that additional compliance reviews might become necessary. I refused every request for an interior inspection because no governing document required me to open private spaces without proper legal authority. I had spent enough years reading contracts during renovation projects to understand that words mattered. If the governing documents granted certain inspection rights, I would have honored them. They did not. Instead, they described exterior maintenance standards, landscaping requirements, architectural approvals, and common area responsibilities. Nothing authorized random entry into a locked garage containing private property. That refusal appeared to frustrate Susan even more. During one board meeting, she looked directly at me and said homeowners who had nothing to hide should welcome inspections. I calmly replied that respecting private property was not the same as hiding something. Several neighbors nodded quietly, while others avoided eye contact. I left that meeting knowing the conversation was far from over. The following weeks brought more drive-by photographs, more violation notices, and more assumptions disguised as official findings. Rather than arguing with each new letter, I organized every envelope, every email, every certified mailing receipt, and every response inside a labeled binder in my office. I believe documentation solved problems far better than emotion. Standing outside my own garage now, listening to people who clearly believed they had finally found the proof they wanted, I realized the careful records I had been keeping were about to become far more valuable than anyone inside that building could possibly imagine. I kept my back against the outside wall of the garage, resisting every urge to swing the door open and demand an explanation. The cameras were already doing something far more valuable than my voice ever could. Every passing second quietly preserved another piece of evidence that nobody inside seemed to realize they were creating. I zoomed in on the live video feed and studied each movement carefully. One inspector walked directly to the shelving unit where I stored antique door hardware waiting to be installed at restoration sites. Another opened drawers containing precision measuring equipment, carefully photographing labels before writing notes on a clipboard. Susan Whitmore stood near my workbench, pointing toward stacks of reclaimed lumber while speaking with complete confidence. I could not hear every word clearly through the wall, but I caught enough to understand they believed they had finally confirmed the story they had been building for months. Then I noticed something that completely changed how I looked at the situation. The side service door they had entered through showed no visible damage. That immediately caught my attention because I had replaced every exterior lock on the property 3 years earlier after purchasing a high-security system recommended by one of my commercial clients. The only people with working keys were me and my brother, who lived 2 states away and had not visited in over a year. Even the locksmith who installed the hardware explained that duplicate keys required my authorization and identification. If these inspectors had not forced the lock, then how exactly had they entered my garage? I quietly stepped farther from the doorway and opened another application on my phone. My security system included smart access records for every protected entry point. Within seconds, the event history appeared on the screen. The front door had remained locked all morning. The back patio door had never opened. The garage side entrance showed something unexpected. Instead of recording a valid key entry, the system logged the door as opening without authentication at exactly 10:38 that morning. I read the line twice just to make sure I had not misunderstood it. That status appeared only when a door opened without a recognized credential, such as when it failed to latch properly after being manipulated or when it was accessed in an unauthorized manner. I immediately captured screenshots of the log and saved duplicate copies to cloud storage. Years of restoring historic buildings had taught me that preserving original records mattered because memories faded while documents remained unchanged. I returned to the camera feed just in time to watch one inspector raise a camera toward a storage cabinet containing paint samples and restoration chemicals that were all properly labeled and legally stored. Another photographed my rolling tool chest from 3 different angles. Susan nodded with quiet satisfaction, as if every image strengthened her position. Ironically, those same photographs would soon raise a far more important question. They could only have been taken by someone standing deep inside a locked private garage. They believed they were documenting violations. What they were actually documenting was their own presence in a place they had never been authorized to enter. And every digital record sitting safely on my phone was beginning to tell exactly the same story from a different angle. The first thing I did after quietly stepping away from the garage was silence my phone, so not even a notification could give away that I was nearby. I walked back toward my pickup truck, climbed inside without starting the engine, and continued watching every camera feed from a safe distance. Nearly 15 minutes passed before the garage door finally opened from the inside. Susan Whitmore stepped out first with a folder tucked under one arm, while the two inspectors followed carrying clipboards and cameras. They looked relaxed, almost satisfied, as though they believed the hardest part of their day was already behind them. None of them glanced toward my truck. None of them looked up at the security cameras mounted beneath the roofline. They simply closed the side door, returned to their vehicles parked along the curb, and drove away one after another. I waited another 5 minutes before walking back to the garage. The moment I stepped inside, I resisted the temptation to inspect everything at once. Instead, I followed the same routine I used whenever documenting conditions at restoration sites. I slowly recorded a complete video of the room exactly as I found it. Every cabinet, every shelf, every workbench, every storage bin. I narrated the date and time while moving the camera across the entire space, so there would be no question about what existed immediately after the inspection. Only after finishing that recording did I begin looking more closely. Several cabinet doors had been left slightly open. A drawer containing measuring instruments had not been pushed completely shut. One storage tote sat several inches away from the place where I always kept it against the wall. Nothing appeared damaged or missing, but someone had clearly searched through areas that had nothing to do with exterior property maintenance. I then downloaded copies of every security recording from that morning onto 2 external hard drives before uploading encrypted backups to cloud storage. Experience had taught me never to rely on a single copy of important evidence. Once the files finished transferring, I printed the smart access history showing the unauthorized door opening and placed those pages inside the same binder that already contained months of correspondence from the Homeowners Association. Late the following afternoon, another certified envelope appeared in my mailbox. I recognized the return address immediately. Sitting at my kitchen table, I carefully opened the packet and unfolded the violation notice. The language sounded unusually confident. According to the letter, inspectors had observed multiple conditions supporting additional compliance action. Attached behind the notice were several color photographs. I studied each image one at a time. The first showed my restoration tools lined up against the back wall. The second focused on shelves containing paint supplies. Another captured equipment sitting beside my workbench from an angle that instantly caught my attention. I stood up, walked into the garage, and compared the printed photograph to the actual room. There was no doubt about it. That picture could only have been taken from nearly 12 feet inside the building, facing directly toward the rear wall. No person standing outside an open doorway could ever produce that angle. I returned to the kitchen, placed the photograph beside the security camera timeline, and quietly smiled. The violation letter had been intended to strengthen their case. Instead, it had unknowingly become one more carefully dated document proving exactly where they had been. By the next morning, I had stopped thinking like a frustrated homeowner and started thinking like someone preparing a complete project file. Restoring historic buildings had taught me that successful work depended on careful documentation, not assumptions, and this situation deserved exactly the same approach. Before leaving for my scheduled appointments, I made 3 identical copies of every important record. One binder stayed locked inside the fireproof cabinet in my office. Another went into a secure safe deposit box at my bank. The third remained with me. I wanted every photograph, every access log, every camera recording, every certified letter, and every email preserved exactly as they existed that day. Nothing would be edited, renamed, or reorganized beyond creating a clear timeline. That afternoon, I scheduled an appointment with the locksmith who had installed my security hardware several years earlier. After inspecting the side entrance, he carefully examined the lock cylinder, strike plate, hinges, and surrounding frame. His conclusion surprised even me. The lock itself showed no signs of mechanical failure and no evidence that a properly authorized key had been used. However, the latch bore subtle marks consistent with someone manipulating the door while it had not fully seated into the frame. He explained that if a door failed to latch completely, it could sometimes be opened without generating a normal credential record, matching the unusual events stored by my security system. He documented his observations in a written service report and included timestamped photographs for his records. That report immediately became another piece of my growing evidence file. Later that evening, I exported the original security recordings directly from the camera system using their native format instead of compressed copies. Each file retained embedded metadata showing the exact recording times, camera identification numbers, and creation history. I verified the digital checksums and saved them alongside printed copies of the smart access logs. The more carefully I organized everything, the more obvious the timeline became. Months of accusation had been followed by repeated requests for interior access. After those requests were denied, inspectors entered the garage anyway. Less than 24 hours later, an official violation letter arrived containing interior photographs that matched the recorded visit almost minute for minute. Nothing in that sequence depended on memory or personal opinion. Every event was supported by independent documentation. Rather than contacting the homeowners association, I called an attorney who specialized in property and association disputes. During our first meeting, he spent nearly an hour reviewing the binder without interrupting. Occasionally, he asked for a specific date or requested another document, but mostly he simply followed the timeline I had assembled. When he reached the printed photographs attached to the violation notice, he placed them beside still images from the security cameras and quietly nodded. He told me the most valuable part of the entire file was not a dramatic moment or emotional reaction. It was the consistency. Every document supported the next one. Every timestamp matched. Every record strengthened the overall sequence instead of contradicting it. As I left his office carrying the same binder I had been building for months, I realized something important. Susan Whitmore believed she was increasing pressure by sending another violation notice. In reality, every official letter, every photograph, and every statement issued by the Homeowners Association was quietly expanding the evidence that would eventually tell the complete story far more clearly than either of us ever could. Over the next several days, the Homeowners Association became noticeably more aggressive, but the pressure only confirmed that they believed their own version of events. Another certified letter arrived stating that daily fines would begin if the alleged violations were not corrected immediately. A second notice warned that additional legal fees could be added to my account if I continued refusing to cooperate with compliance efforts. The language sounded increasingly urgent, yet none of the letters addressed the simple question I had asked from the beginning. What authority allowed anyone to enter my locked garage? My attorney advised me not to respond emotionally or argue point by point. Instead, every communication from that moment forward would be preserved without comment while we quietly expanded the evidence file. Following his advice, I continued my normal routine. I left for restoration projects before sunrise, met clients, inspected historic properties, and returned home each evening as though nothing unusual had happened. At the same time, I maintained a detailed activity log recording every delivery, every visitor, every letter received, and every conversation related to the dispute. The consistency of that routine became valuable because it demonstrated that my daily life had never matched the exaggerated picture described in the violation notices. Around the neighborhood, I began noticing subtle changes in how people reacted. A few neighbors who usually waved from their driveways suddenly seemed uncertain after hearing rumors that I was operating an unauthorized commercial business from my home. Others politely asked whether everything was all right after seeing additional compliance notices appear in my mailbox. I never criticized Susan Whitmore or the board. I simply told anyone who asked that the matter was being handled through proper documentation and that the facts would eventually speak for themselves. That answer usually ended the conversation because there was very little to argue with. Meanwhile, my attorney submitted formal requests for every document connected to the inspections. He requested inspection authorizations, internal correspondence, meeting minutes discussing my property, photographs in their original digital format, and records identifying every person who had participated in the visit. The requests were specific, organized, and impossible to misunderstand. Days passed before the first responses arrived. Several documents confirmed routine administrative procedures, but something important was missing. There was no written authorization approving entry into my garage. There was no signed consent for me. There was no board resolution specifically permitting inspectors to access the interior of a locked private structure. Even more interesting, the inspection report described observations that could only have been made from inside the building while never actually explaining how the inspectors entered. My attorney quietly added each response to the growing binder without making accusations. He simply placed every new page into chronological order beside the security recordings, access logs, locksmith report, and certified letters. Looking through the completed timeline felt almost like reading a carefully assembled history book. Every official action taken by the Homeowners Association unintentionally strengthened the sequence rather than weakening it. The more paperwork they produced, the more obvious the unanswered questions became. By the end of that week, I realized the dispute was no longer centered on whether my garage contained restoration tools. The real issue had become the documented path the inspectors took to reach those tools, and every piece of evidence continued pointing in exactly the same direction, while the silence surrounding that single unanswered question grew louder with each passing day. The turning point arrived when my attorney received the complete production of documents requested from the Homeowners Association. We spread everything across the large conference table in his office, arranging each record by date until the entire dispute unfolded like a timeline that neither side could change. There were emails discussing complaints, inspection summaries, certified letters, meeting notes, and internal memorandums. At first glance, it appeared to be an impressive stack of paperwork, but the more carefully we examined it, the more obvious the gaps became. The inspection report listed observations from inside my garage with remarkable detail. It described shelving locations, specific restoration equipment, storage cabinets, paint supplies, and work areas that could never have been seen from the driveway or through a closed garage door. Yet nowhere in hundreds of pages did anyone explain how the inspectors legally entered the building. My attorney highlighted every reference to the interior of the garage while placing those pages beside still images from my security recordings. The sequence matched almost perfectly. The timestamps aligned with the camera footage. The descriptions matched objects visible on the recordings. Even the order in which the inspectors moved from one side of the garage to the other closely mirrored what the cameras had captured. Then another detail surfaced. One internal email referenced photographs that had supposedly been taken during a routine exterior compliance inspection. That wording immediately caught our attention because several of the attached images showed viewpoints located more than 10 feet inside the garage. My attorney quietly measured the approximate camera positions using a scaled floor plan of the building that I had originally prepared during a renovation project. Every estimated location placed the photographer well beyond the threshold of the doorway. There was simply no reasonable way those images could have been captured from outside. The following week, the association agreed to participate in mediation before the dispute moved any further. My attorney told me not to expect dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations. He explained that successful cases often turned on organization rather than volume. We prepared a presentation consisting entirely of original documents, synchronized timelines, security footage, access records, photographs, and service reports. Nothing depended upon personal opinion. Every page supported another page. Every digital record confirmed another digital record. As the meeting approached, additional correspondence arrived from the Homeowners Association attempting to justify the inspection as part of ordinary compliance responsibilities. Those explanations introduced something entirely new. They now claimed the garage door had been standing open when inspectors arrived. I quietly smiled after reading that sentence because my driveway camera clearly recorded the overhead door remaining fully closed until after the inspectors left the property. The same recording also showed my truck arriving only after their vehicles had already departed. Instead of helping their position, the new explanation added another statement that conflicted with objective evidence. My attorney simply placed the latest letter into the binder without making any comments. Looking at the completed file one final time, I realized it no longer resembled a disagreement between a homeowner and an association. It looked like a carefully documented history in which every attempt to explain the inspection only created another contradiction. The people who had believed they were building a case against me had gradually assembled a detailed record demonstrating something entirely different. And for the first time since I heard unfamiliar voices inside my garage, I felt completely confident that the truth no longer depended on what anyone claimed because it was already preserved in documents that all pointed toward exactly the same conclusion. The mediation session took place in a quiet conference room at a neutral office building just outside downtown. There were no raised voices, no dramatic interruptions, and no emotional speeches. Everyone sat around a long wooden table while folders, laptops, and legal pads slowly filled the space between us. Susan Whitmore arrived with two representatives from the Homeowners Association and their attorney. My attorney simply placed our binder on the table without saying much. He had reminded me several times that the strongest evidence rarely needed dramatic presentation because facts organized in the proper order usually carried their own weight. After brief introductions, the mediator invited the Homeowners Association to explain the basis for the violations. Susan confidently described months of suspected commercial activity, repeated complaints, and what she called a routine compliance inspection. She repeated the same claim from her latest letter, stating that inspectors had observed the interior only because the garage door had been open when they arrived. When she finished, the mediator turned toward our side of the table. My attorney stood, connected a laptop to the conference room display, and opened the first security recording. The video showed the driveway exactly as it appeared that morning. The garage door remained completely closed while the inspectors arrived and walked toward the side entrance. The recording continued without interruption, showing no overhead door movement at any point before they entered. The room became noticeably quieter. My attorney then displayed synchronized footage from the interior garage camera. Every timestamp matched the exterior recording to the second. The inspectors appeared inside the garage, opening cabinets, photographing shelves, examining restoration tools, and writing notes while the garage door remained closed. Next came the smart access records showing the unauthorized door opening event. Then the locksmith's written report explaining why no authenticated credential had been used. After that, the original photographs attached to the violation notice appeared beside still images captured directly from the security recordings. Every angle matched perfectly. The conference room monitor displayed side-by-side comparisons proving that the photographs submitted as inspection evidence had been taken from positions well inside the garage. Finally, my attorney projected a scaled floor plan of the building with estimated camera locations corresponding to each photograph. The visual comparison required almost no explanation. The only way those images could exist was if someone had entered the locked garage. The mediator quietly reviewed the documents for several minutes before asking the Homeowners Association a simple question. Could they produce any written authorization permitting entry into the interior of my private garage? Their attorney searched through several folders before acknowledging that no such authorization existed in the records provided. Another long silence followed. Susan attempted to explain that the inspection had been performed in good faith, but each statement was immediately measured against objective records already displayed on the screen. Every attempt to reconcile the timeline created another inconsistency rather than resolving the existing ones. By the time the final document had been reviewed, nobody in the room seemed interested in discussing restoration tools or supposed business activity anymore. The entire conversation had shifted toward documented procedure, authorized access, and the undeniable sequence preserved by security cameras, digital logs, official correspondence, and the Homeowners Association's own inspection records. Without raising my voice a single time, I watched months of accusations quietly collapse beneath the weight of the evidence they had unknowingly helped create themselves. The resolution came quietly, almost anticlimactically, after months of tension that had once seemed impossible to escape. Within a week of the mediation session, my attorney received a formal letter from the Homeowners Association stating that every violation notice issued against my property had been withdrawn in its entirety. All proposed fines were canceled, all enforcement actions were terminated, and my account reflected a zero balance. The letter carefully avoided discussing the security recordings or the unauthorized entry, but it confirmed that the association would take no further action regarding the allegations that had consumed so much of the previous year. A few days later, another notice arrived informing homeowners that Susan Whitmore would no longer serve as compliance director while the board conducted an internal review of inspection procedures. No additional explanation was provided, and none was necessary. The timeline, the documents, and the recordings had already explained everything more clearly than any public statement ever could. I placed both letters into the same binder that had grown thicker with every accusation, every certified envelope, every access log, every service report, and every camera recording. Looking through those pages one last time, I realized the binder had become more than a collection of evidence. It was a complete history showing how patience had quietly outlasted assumption. Life returned to normal much faster than I expected. Delivery trucks continued arriving with reclaimed lumber and restoration materials. My garage once again became nothing more than a workshop where old doors, handcrafted moldings, and historic hardware waited for their next project. Neighbors who had once seemed uncertain gradually returned to friendly conversations while walking their dogs or checking the mail. A few privately admitted they had assumed the violation notices meant the homeowners association must have been correct. I never criticized them for believing official letters. Instead, I simply explained that documents should always be examined carefully because facts and conclusions were not always the same thing. During one conversation, an elderly neighbor smiled and said she had started organizing her own property records after watching everything unfold. That simple comment stayed with me longer than any formal letter because it reminded me that one person's experience could quietly encourage others to protect themselves before problems ever developed. I also upgraded my security system, not because I expected another incident, but because I had learned how valuable accurate records could become when questions arose. Additional cameras covered every approach to the garage. Encrypted backups were created automatically and monthly. System checks became part of my regular routine alongside maintaining my tools. One calm Saturday evening, after finishing another restoration project, I stood in the driveway watching the sun settle behind the trees while the garage door slowly closed at the end of the day. Months earlier, that same building had become the center of rumors, accusations, and unwanted attention. Now it simply represented something much more important. It reminded me that private property deserved respect, that careful preparation was stronger than emotional reactions, and that truth did not need dramatic speeches to prevail. Sometimes justice arrived quietly, carried by timestamps, photographs, organized records, and the patience to let every fact find its proper place. As I locked the garage and walked toward the house, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving someone else wrong. It had been proving that integrity, backed by evidence and presented with calm determination, could restore both peace and trust without ever raising a single voice.